The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan as Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez adjusted his rifle scope for the third time in 10 minutes. 3,000 feet below him, barely visible through the rocky terrain, his teammates were walking straight into what he suspected might be a trap. The intelligence had seemed too good to be true from the start, but orders were orders, and the Navy SEALs had a job to do. Rodriguez had been positioned on the mountain peak since 0300 hours, nearly 6 hours of lying motionless behind his Barrett M82 sniper rifle. His spotter, Petty Officer First Class James Hawk Harrison, lay beside him with high-powered binoculars, scanning the valley below for any signs of enemy movement. The two men had worked together for over 2 years, developing an almost telepathic communication that had saved countless lives in previous operations. "Still nothing on the eastern ridge," Hawk whispered, his voice barely audible even to Rodriguez, who was lying just inches away. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and dust, masking any other smells that might indicate human presence in the area. Both men knew that in this part of Afghanistan, silence often meant danger was lurking just out of sight. The mission had started 3 days earlier when intelligence officers at Bagram Airfield received word that a high-value target was hiding in a small village nestled between two mountain ranges. The target, known only as the Engineer, was reportedly responsible for designing the improvised explosive devices that had killed dozens of coalition forces over the past 6 months. Finding him had become a top priority for Special Operations Command. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen had briefed the team personally, her usually calm demeanor showing hints of urgency that Rodriguez had rarely seen before. The Engineer had been tracked to a compound in the village of Kailari Kush, a remote settlement that housed fewer than 200 people. Local informants had provided detailed maps of the area, including the location of the target's supposed hideout. "This is our best chance to get him," Chen had told the assembled SEALs. "But we need to move fast. Intelligence suggests he's planning to relocate within 48 hours. The plan was straightforward: a 6-man team would approach the village from the south while Rodriguez and Hawk provided overwatch from the mountain peak to the north. Air support would be on standby, but the remote location meant they would be largely on their own until extraction. Rodriguez remembered feeling uneasy during the briefing, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Something about the timing seemed off. The Engineer had successfully evaded capture for months, moving like a ghost through the mountains. Why would he suddenly become careless enough to stay in one location for multiple days? But Rodriguez kept his concerns to himself, trusting in his team's abilities and training. The insertion had gone smoothly. A Black Hawk helicopter had dropped Rodriguez and Hawk at their observation point under cover of darkness, while the main assault team had been inserted 5 kilometers away. The pilot had managed to land despite the difficult terrain, and both snipers had quickly established their position with clear sightlines to the target village. As dawn broke, Rodriguez could see the village coming to life below. Smoke began rising from cooking fires, and figures moved between the mud brick buildings. Through his scope, everything appeared normal. Children played in the dusty streets while women carried water jugs and men tended to livestock. There were no obvious signs of Taliban presence or unusual activity. "Alpha Team, this is Overwatch," Rodriguez spoke quietly into his radio. "Village appears quiet. Normal civilian activity observed. No hostile contacts visible." The response came back immediately from Chief Petty Officer Marcus Bull Williams, the team leader of the assault group. "Copy, Overwatch. Alpha Team is 2 kilometers out and moving to final position. Estimate 15 minutes to target building." Rodriguez adjusted his position slightly, ensuring he had clear fields of fire to both the target building and potential escape routes. The compound they were targeting sat at the eastern edge of the village, a 2-story structure with thick walls and a flat roof. According to intelligence, the Engineer was believed to be hiding in a basement workshop where he assembled his deadly devices. Hawk lowered his binoculars and turned to Rodriguez with a concerned expression. "Something's bothering me about this whole setup," he said quietly. "Look at the rooftops. See anything unusual?" Rodriguez swung his scope across the village rooftops, scanning each building carefully. At first, everything seemed normal, but then he noticed it. Several buildings had small piles of debris or equipment that hadn't been there in the satellite photos from the previous week.
Upon closer inspection, these items could easily conceal weapon positions or communications equipment.
"I see it," Rodriguez replied, feeling his heart rate increase slightly.
Multiple potential fighting positions prepared in advance. This doesn't look like a coincidence.
"Alpha Team, this is Overwatch," Rodriguez called into his radio with more urgency. "We're observing possible pre-positioned fighting positions throughout the village.
Recommend extreme caution on approach."
Bull's voice crackled back over the radio, slightly distorted by static.
"Copy, Overwatch. We're proceeding with mission. Intel confidence is high on target location.
Maintain watch and advise of any changes." Rodriguez felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same feeling he'd experienced before previous ambushes. His instincts, honed by years of combat experience, were screaming that something was wrong. But he also knew that aborting a mission based solely on gut feelings wasn't always an option, especially when the target was as important as the engineer.
As the assault team moved into position, Rodriguez continued scanning the village through his scope.
The civilian activity was beginning to decrease, which could be normal as the day grew warmer, but it also might indicate that locals had been warned to stay indoors. He noticed that several of the men who had been visible earlier were no longer in sight, and the few remaining women and children seemed to be moving with more purpose than before. "Hawk, take a look at grid reference 41 SMU 12345-67890, Rodriguez said, referring to the precise military coordinates.
"That building with the green door. See the reflection coming from the second-floor window?"
Hawk raised his binoculars and focused on the location Rodriguez had indicated. After several seconds of careful observation, he lowered the binoculars with a grim expression.
"That's definitely glass or metal reflecting sunlight. Could be a scope or binoculars. Someone's watching."
The realization hit both snipers simultaneously. If enemy observers were positioned throughout the village, they would have already spotted the approaching SEAL team. The mission had likely been compromised from the moment they entered the area. Rodriguez immediately reached for his radio to warn the assault team, but before he could speak, Bull's voice came through the static.
"Overwatch, this is Alpha Team.
We're at the compound perimeter.
Beginning final approach to target building.
No contacts observed." Rodriguez keyed his radio quickly.
"Alpha Team, abort mission immediately. Village is compromised. Multiple observer positions identified. This is a trap."
There was a long pause before Bull responded, and, when he did, his voice carried the weight of a difficult decision. "Overwatch, we're already committed.
Target building is 50 meters ahead. We can't extract without compromising our position further. Continuing mission."
Through his scope, Rodriguez watched as 6 figures in camouflage moved slowly toward the compound. Even from 3,000 feet away, he could see the careful, practiced movements of highly trained operators. Each SEAL maintained proper spacing and cover, their weapons ready for immediate action. But Rodriguez also knew that all the training in the world might not be enough if they were walking into a well-prepared ambush. The target building appeared empty, its windows dark and door closed. No smoke rose from its chimney, and no signs of recent activity were visible around its perimeter. But Rodriguez had learned long ago that appearances could be deadly deceptive in Afghanistan. The Taliban had become masters of using seemingly abandoned buildings as strongholds, often with hidden tunnels and escape routes.
"Alpha Team entering compound," Bull's voice reported over the radio.
"Overwatch, maintain surveillance on escape routes and provide updates on any movement." Rodriguez shifted his scope to scan the areas around the compound where fleeing targets might emerge. The village had numerous alleyways and side streets that could provide concealment for escaping personnel. Several larger buildings could hide vehicles or additional fighters. The longer he observed, the more convinced he became that the entire village was a carefully prepared killing zone. Hawk had switched to a different sector, watching the northern approach to the village where reinforcements might come from. His binoculars swept methodically across the rocky terrain, looking for any signs of movement or concealed positions. Both snipers knew that their teammates below were depending on them for early warning of threats. Movement in the target building, Rodriguez reported as he saw a shadow cross briefly past one of the windows.
One person, second floor, moving from east to west. Cannot determine if friendly or hostile. Alpha team copies. We're breaching now.
Through his scope, Rodriguez watched as the SEALs approached the building's main entrance. The team moved with practiced precision, 2 men covering the entrance while others checked for explosives or tripwires. Even at this distance, Rodriguez could see the tension in their body language as they prepared to enter what might be a trap. The explosion, when it came, was not from the building they were entering. Instead, Rodriguez saw a bright flash from a rooftop 200 meters away, followed by the distinctive crack of a sniper rifle. One of the SEALs below immediately dropped behind cover, though Rodriguez couldn't tell if anyone had been hit.
Contact! Bull's voice shouted over the radio. Sniper fire from the north. Alpha 2 is hit. Repeat, Alpha 2 is down.
Almost immediately, muzzle flashes began appearing from multiple buildings throughout the village. The Taliban fighters had been positioned and waiting, and now they were revealing themselves in a coordinated attack. Rodriguez could see at least 8 different firing positions, with more likely hidden from his view. Overwatch to Alpha Team, Rodriguez called into his radio while already beginning to track targets through his scope. Multiple enemy positions identified. Preparing to engage. The SEAL team below had taken cover behind low walls and vehicles, but they were clearly outnumbered and surrounded. Return fire was sporadic as they tried to identify and engage the numerous enemy positions. Rodriguez could see that Alpha 2, Petty Officer 2nd Class Kevin Martinez, was wounded but still moving, having been dragged to cover by his teammates.
Alpha Team, this is Overwatch, Rodriguez reported as he settled his crosshairs on the first target. I count at least 10 enemy positions. You're completely surrounded. Recommend immediate extraction. Bull's response was immediate and defiant. Negative, Overwatch. We don't leave without the target or Alpha 2. Provide fire support and keep those snipers off us. Rodriguez took a deep breath and centered his scope on a muzzle flash that had appeared in a third-story window 400 meters from the SEAL team's position. The range to target was nearly 3,500 meters, accounting for the elevation difference, requiring him to adjust for both bullet drop and the mountain wind conditions. The Taliban sniper in his crosshairs fired again at the pinned-down SEALs, confirming his position. Rodriguez made his final adjustments, controlled his breathing, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The Barrett M82's powerful .50 caliber round covered the distance in less than 3 seconds, striking the enemy sniper and immediately eliminating the threat from that position. Target down, Rodriguez reported calmly while already shifting to acquire his next target. 1 sniper eliminated. But, even as Rodriguez engaged the enemy snipers, more fighters were appearing throughout the village. What had started as a precision raid to capture a high-value target was rapidly becoming a desperate fight for survival. The Taliban had clearly anticipated the SEAL team's arrival and had prepared accordingly. Hawk spotted movement on a distant ridgeline and called out coordinates to Rodriguez. Multiple vehicles approaching from the northeast. Looks like reinforcements. This is about to get much worse. Rodriguez paused his target engagement long enough to glass the approaching vehicles through his scope. He could see at least 3 trucks loaded with armed fighters, still several kilometers away but closing fast. The SEAL team below was already outnumbered and surrounded. The arrival of additional Taliban forces would make their situation critical. Alpha Team, be advised, Rodriguez called into his radio while tracking another sniper. Enemy reinforcements approaching from the northeast. Estimated 15 to 20 additional fighters inbound. The response from Bull was strained but determined. Copy, Overwatch. We're going to make our way to the target building. If the engineer is really here, we're not leaving without him. Keep the snipers off us for 2 more minutes. Rodriguez acquired his next target, another Taliban fighter who had been taking aim shots at the SEAL team from a concealed position on a nearby rooftop. The enemy fighter was partially hidden behind a low wall, presenting only a small target area. Rodriguez calculated the range at 3,200 meters and adjusted his aim point accordingly. The shot was perfect, striking the Taliban fighter and immediately eliminating another threat to his teammates below. But Rodriguez knew that individual sniper shots, no matter how accurate, might not be enough to change the overall tactical situation. The enemy had clearly planned this ambush carefully and had positioned far more fighters than intelligence had indicated. 2 down, Rodriguez reported while scanning for his next target. But there are too many of them, Bull. You need to consider extraction while you still can. Through his scope, Rodriguez watched as the SEAL team began moving toward the target building under heavy fire. The Taliban fighters were focusing most of their attention on the Americans below, which gave Rodriguez clear shots at several enemy positions. But he also knew that his muzzle flashes were revealing his position on the mountain, and soon the enemy would begin directing fire toward him and Hawk. As if reading his thoughts, Hawk called out a warning. "Rodriguez, we've got company. 2 fighters moving up the mountain slope toward our position. Range 800 meters and closing." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The SEAL team below was pinned down and surrounded, enemy reinforcements were approaching, and now Rodriguez and Hawk's overwatch position was being compromised. In a few minutes, the tactical advantage provided by the mountaintop sniper position would be lost, leaving all 8 SEALs isolated and outnumbered in hostile territory. Rodriguez made another shot, dropping a Taliban fighter who had been moving to flank the SEAL team's position. As he worked the bolt action to chamber another round, he caught a glimpse of movement in the target building. Someone was definitely inside, though whether it was the engineer, Taliban fighters, or someone else entirely remained unclear. "Alpha Team," Rodriguez called into his radio while tracking another target. "Someone is moving inside the target building. Cannot identify if friendly or hostile." Bull's response was barely audible over the sound of gunfire. "We're almost there." 30 seconds out. Rodriguez continued engaging Taliban positions while Hawk kept watch on the approaching enemy fighters. The mountain wind had picked up, affecting long-range accuracy, but Rodriguez compensated with practiced skill. Each shot had to count, as the enemy was beginning to return fire toward their position. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rounds passing overhead told Rodriguez that the Taliban fighters approaching their position were getting closer. Soon he and Hawk would have to abandon their overwatch position or risk being overrun. But leaving now would mean abandoning the SEAL team below to face impossible odds. As Rodriguez prepared to engage another target, he heard Hawk's urgent warning: "Contact close. Enemy fighters 500 meters and climbing fast. We've got maybe 3 minutes before they reach us." The moment of truth was approaching. 8 Navy SEALs were trapped in a remote Afghan village, surrounded by enemy fighters with reinforcements approaching. Their only advantage was Rodriguez's sniper rifle and his ability to eliminate threats from a distance. But that advantage was about to be lost as enemy fighters closed in on their mountain position. Rodriguez took a deep breath, steadied his rifle, and prepared for the fight of his life. The next few minutes would determine whether his teammates lived or died, and failure was not an option. Rodriguez made a split-second decision that would define the next crucial minutes. Instead of engaging the Taliban fighters approaching his position, he swung his rifle back toward the village to continue protecting his teammates below. Hawk would have to handle the immediate threat climbing the mountain while Rodriguez provided the critical overwatch support that kept the surrounded SEAL team alive. "Hawk, you've got the close contacts," Rodriguez said without taking his eye from the scope. "I'm staying on the village. The team down there is depending on us." Hawk immediately transitioned from observer to combatant, pulling his M4 carbine into position and moving to a defensive firing position among the rocks. The approaching Taliban fighters were still 400 meters away but climbing steadily through the rocky terrain. Hawk had trained extensively for exactly this type of close-quarters mountain fighting. Through his scope, Rodriguez watched the SEAL team's desperate advance toward the target building. Bull and his men were moving in short bounds, using every available piece of cover as Taliban fighters poured automatic weapons fire down on them from multiple directions. The volume of enemy fire was incredible, with muzzle flashes visible from at least 15 different positions throughout the village. Rodriguez acquired a target in a 2-story building where a Taliban fighter with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher was taking aim at the advancing SEALs. The range was 3,400 meters with a strong crosswind,
but Rodriguez had made similar shots countless times before. He adjusted his aim point, controlled his breathing, and fired. The .50 caliber round struck the RPG gunner's center mass, eliminating him instantly and causing the unexpended rocket to fall harmlessly to the ground. Rodriguez immediately chambered another round and began scanning for his next target. Every shot had to count, as his teammates below were running out of cover and options. "Good shot," came Bull's voice over the radio, slightly breathless from exertion and stress. "That RPG would have ended our day quickly."
"We're 50 meters from the building now."
Rodriguez continued his methodical elimination of enemy threats while listening to the steady crack of Hawk's M4 carbine engaging the Taliban fighters climbing toward their position. The enemy was clearly determined to eliminate the sniper overwatch that was proving so devastating to their ambush. But Hawk was holding them at bay, buying precious time for the village operation below. Through his scope, Rodriguez could see that Petty Officer Martinez, the wounded SEAL, was being half-carried by another team member but was still returning fire when possible. The team's discipline and training were evident in how they continued to function as a cohesive unit despite being outnumbered and surrounded. But Rodriguez also knew that even the best training had its limits when facing overwhelming odds. A new muzzle flash appeared from a minaret overlooking the village, and Rodriguez realized that the Taliban had positioned a sniper in the mosque tower with a clear field of fire over the entire area. The enemy sniper immediately began engaging the SEAL team with aimed, precise shots that forced them to take cover behind increasingly inadequate protection. Rodriguez shifted his rifle toward the minaret, but the Taliban sniper was well concealed behind the tower's stone walls with only occasional exposure when taking shots. Rodriguez would have to time his shot perfectly, waiting for the enemy sniper to expose himself long enough to provide a target. The range was over 3,000 meters with unpredictable wind conditions caused by the mountain terrain. "Alpha Team, be advised," Rodriguez called into his radio while maintaining his sight picture on the minaret.
"Enemy sniper in the mosque tower is targeting your position. I'm attempting to eliminate." Bull's response was immediate, "Copy. We're taking accurate fire from elevation. Handle it quickly if you can."
Rodriguez watched through his scope as the enemy sniper's rifle barrel appeared briefly at the edge of the tower opening. The target was there for less than 2 seconds before disappearing back into concealment. Rodriguez would have to anticipate the next appearance and be ready to fire the instant the target became visible. Behind him, Hawk's engagement with the approaching Taliban fighters was intensifying. The enemy had closed to within 300 meters and was advancing under covering fire from their companions. Hawk was forced to change positions frequently to avoid being pinned down by the increasing volume of incoming fire. "Rodriguez, they're getting close," Hawk called out between bursts of automatic weapons fire. "I can hold them for maybe another 5 minutes, but then we're going to have serious problems up here." Rodriguez remained focused on the minaret, waiting for the enemy sniper to reappear. The Taliban fighter was experienced and disciplined, taking only quick, aimed shots before returning to cover. But Rodriguez had fought similar enemies before and knew that even experienced snipers eventually made mistakes when under pressure. The enemy sniper's rifle appeared again at the tower opening, and this time Rodriguez was ready. He led the target slightly to account for movement and fired the instant he had a clear sight picture. The .50 caliber round struck the stone wall just inches from where the enemy sniper had been positioned, sending fragments of ancient masonry flying but missing the target. "Missed," Rodriguez muttered to himself while working the bolt action to chamber another round. The enemy sniper had immediately withdrawn deeper into the tower after the near miss, realizing that he was being targeted by an extremely accurate marksman. But Rodriguez knew the Taliban fighter would have to reappear eventually to continue engaging the SEAL team below. Through his radio earpiece, Rodriguez could hear the constant chatter of the embattled SEAL team as they coordinated their final approach to the target building. They were now less than 30 meters away but were taking increasingly heavy fire from multiple directions. The Taliban fighters had clearly prepared this ambush carefully, with overlapping fields of fire that made movement extremely dangerous. "Alpha Team to Overwatch," Bull's voice called out with obvious strain. "We need immediate suppression of the building complex at grid 41 SMU 12350-67885.
Multiple automatic weapons positions are concentrating fire on our approach route.
Rodriguez immediately shifted his rifle toward the coordinates Bull had provided. Through his scope, he could see a cluster of single-story buildings where muzzle flashes were visible from at least 4 different positions. The Taliban fighters were firing continuously, creating a wall of bullets that prevented the SEALs from advancing further. Rodriguez began engaging the automatic weapons positions systematically, starting with the one that appeared to have the best field of fire over the SEAL team's position. His first shot struck a Taliban fighter manning a PKM machine gun, immediately silencing that position. He quickly chambered another round and acquired the next target.
The second automatic weapons position was more challenging, as the Taliban fighters had learned to take cover after each burst of fire.
Rodriguez waited patiently for one of them to expose himself long enough to provide a target.
When a fighter leaned out to reload his weapon, Rodriguez was ready with a precise shot that eliminated the threat.
2 positions down, Rodriguez reported while scanning for additional targets.
Alpha team, you should have a clear corridor for the next 30 seconds. Bull's team immediately took advantage of the suppressed enemy fire to advance rapidly toward the target building.
Rodriguez watched through his scope as the 6 SEALs bounded forward using classic military movement techniques, with some team members providing covering fire while others advanced. Despite being wounded, Martinez was keeping up with his teammates through sheer determination and the assistance of his fellow SEALs. The Taliban fighters in the remaining automatic weapons positions quickly realized what was happening and began firing wildly in an attempt to stop the SEAL team's advance. Their lack of discipline worked in Rodriguez's favor, as the muzzle flashes from their rapid fire revealed their exact positions. He eliminated both remaining machine gun positions with carefully aimed shots.
All automatic weapons positions neutralized, Rodriguez reported. Alpha team has reached the target building.
Through his scope, Rodriguez watched as the SEAL team stacked up outside the building's main entrance. Even from 3,000 feet away, he could see the practiced efficiency with which they prepared to breach and clear the structure. But Rodriguez also noticed something that concerned him. Several Taliban fighters were moving toward the building through alleyways and side streets, apparently attempting to surround the SEALs inside. Alpha team, be advised, Rodriguez called into his radio while tracking the approaching enemy fighters.
Multiple Taliban fighters converging on your position from the east and south. You're about to be surrounded inside the building.
Bull's response was immediate but strained. Copy, Overwatch.
We're going in now. The target is confirmed inside according to thermal imaging. We can't abort now.
Rodriguez watched helplessly as the SEAL team disappeared inside the target building just as Taliban fighters began taking positions around the perimeter. The enemy was clearly executing a well-rehearsed plan to trap the Americans inside and, then, either capture or kill them.
Rodriguez could see at least 10 Taliban fighters moving into position around the building.
Behind him, Hawk's situation was becoming critical as the Taliban fighters ascending the mountain had closed to within 200 meters of their position. The volume of incoming fire was forcing Hawk to stay in cover most of the time, limiting his ability to effectively engage the approaching enemy. Rodriguez knew they would soon have to abandon their Overwatch position or risk being overrun.
Rodriguez, we've got big problems, Hawk called out during a brief lull in the enemy fire. They're almost on top of us, and I'm running low on ammunition. Rodriguez faced an impossible decision. His teammates below were trapped inside a building, surrounded by Taliban fighters who were clearly planning to assault their position. But his own position was about to be overrun by enemy fighters who had specifically targeted the sniper Overwatch that had been so effective against their ambush. Through his scope, Rodriguez could see Taliban fighters placing explosive charges against the walls of the target building. The enemy was planning to breach the structure and assault the trapped SEALs with overwhelming force. Rodriguez realized that conventional sniper fire would not be enough to save his teammates from what was about to happen. Hawk, we need to relocate immediately, Rodriguez said while continuing to track targets through his scope. But I can't leave the team down there to face this alone. Hawk fired several more rounds at the approaching Taliban fighters before responding, we don't have a choice. If we get overrun up here, nobody survives this. Rodriguez made another shot, eliminating a Taliban fighter who was moving an RPG into position to attack the target building.
But, even as he chambered another round, he could see more enemy fighters approaching from multiple directions. The situation was spiraling beyond the ability of two snipers to control, regardless of their skill and determination. The radio crackled with Bull's voice from inside the target building. "Overwatch, we've found the workshop, but the engineer is not here.
This whole thing was a setup. We need immediate extraction."
The confirmation of what Rodriguez had suspected from the beginning brought no satisfaction. The SEAL team had walked into a carefully prepared trap, and now they were fighting for their lives in an impossible situation. The Taliban had clearly known about the mission in advance and had prepared accordingly. "Alpha Team, the building is surrounded," Rodriguez reported while engaging another Taliban fighter approaching with explosives.
"Multiple enemy fighters are placing charges against the walls. You need to find another exit immediately." Bull's response was calm despite the desperate circumstances. "Negative, Overwatch. There is no other exit.
We're going to have to fight our way out through the front door."
Rodriguez realized that conventional tactics were not going to save his teammates.
The Taliban had prepared this ambush too carefully, with too many fighters and too much firepower. But Rodriguez also remembered something from his training that might provide a solution to an impossible situation. Looking through his scope at the target building, Rodriguez could see that it was constructed of traditional Afghan materials, thick mud brick walls with wooden support beams. While these materials provided excellent protection against small arms fire, they had a significant weakness when faced with the massive .50 caliber rounds fired by his Barrett M82 rifle. "Alpha Team, I'm going to create you an exit," Rodriguez called into his radio while shifting his aim point to the building's eastern wall.
"Get everyone away from the east wall immediately." Bull's voice came back with obvious confusion. "Say again, Overwatch? You're going to do what?"
Rodriguez had already calculated the range and adjusted for the angle of fire. The building's eastern wall was approximately 3,200 meters from his position, well within the effective range of his rifle. More importantly, that wall faced away from most of the Taliban fighters, potentially providing the SEALs with an escape route the enemy hadn't anticipated. "Trust me, Bull," Rodriguez said while settling his crosshairs on the wall where he believed the wooden support beam was located behind the mud brick exterior.
"Get everyone away from the east wall and be ready to move on my command." Rodriguez took a deep breath and fired.
The massive .50 caliber round struck the building's eastern wall with tremendous force, sending mud brick and debris flying. But the wall remained standing, though Rodriguez could see that significant damage had been done to its structural integrity. He immediately chambered another round and fired again, this time aiming slightly higher where another support beam was likely located. The second impact created a visible crack running vertically along the wall. Rodriguez realized he was on the right track but would need several more shots to create a breach large enough for the SEALs to use. The third shot struck the wall at its base, near what Rodriguez estimated was the foundation level. The impact sent a shower of debris flying and created another visible crack in the structure. More importantly, Rodriguez could see that the wall was beginning to lean outward as its structural support was systematically destroyed. "Hawk, I need you to spot for me," Rodriguez called to his partner while chambering another round. "Tell me where my impacts are hitting relative to the previous shots." Despite the Taliban fighters closing in on their position, Hawk immediately focused his binoculars on the target building to assist with the precision fire. "Your last shot was 6 inches left of the second impact," he reported calmly.
"The wall is definitely weakening."
Rodriguez made a slight adjustment and fired his fourth shot at the damaged wall. This time the impact was devastating, as the .50 caliber round struck an already weakened area and caused a section of the wall to collapse outward. Rodriguez could see daylight through the newly created hole, though it was still too small for a person to fit through.
"2 more shots should do it," Hawk reported while maintaining his observation of the target. "The whole section is ready to come down."
Rodriguez's fifth shot perfectly struck the remaining structural support, causing a large section of the eastern wall to collapse completely. Through his scope, he could see that the breach was now large enough for the SEALs to escape through, and, more importantly, it faced away from most of the Taliban fighters surrounding the building. "Alpha Team, you now have an exit," Rodriguez reported while scanning the area around the breach for enemy fighters.
Eastern Wall has been breached. The hole is large enough for personnel movement.
Bull's voice came back immediately with obvious relief. Outstanding work, Overwatch. We can see daylight through the breach.
Preparing to extract now.
Through his scope, Rodriguez watched as the first SEAL appeared through the hole in the wall, quickly followed by his teammates. The Taliban fighters were clearly surprised by this development, as most of their attention had been focused on the building's main entrance. But enemy fighters were already beginning to reposition to engage the escaping Americans. Rodriguez immediately began engaging Taliban fighters who were moving toward the breach to cut off the SEAL team's escape route. His position on the mountain peak provided him with clear fields of fire over the area where his teammates were emerging from the building. Every shot had to count, as the enemy was rapidly adapting to the new situation.
Alpha team is clear of the building, Bull reported while his team began moving toward their extraction point. 6 personnel accounted for, including Alpha 2 who was ambulatory with assistance.
But Rodriguez could see through his scope that the team's troubles were far from over. The Taliban reinforcements that had been approaching earlier were now arriving in the village, and the escaping SEALs were still surrounded by enemy fighters. The breach in the building wall had bought them time and mobility, but they were still outnumbered and in hostile territory. Behind Rodriguez, the situation with the approaching Taliban fighters was reaching a critical point. Hawk had been forced into a defensive position among the rocks and was engaging targets at close range. The enemy fighters were now less than 100 meters away and advancing steadily despite taking casualties. "Rodriguez, we're out of time," Hawk called out while changing magazines.
"We have to move now or we're not going to make it out of here."
Rodriguez faced the most difficult decision of his military career. His teammates below were still in danger and depending on his sniper support to survive their extraction. But his own position was about to be overrun, which would not only cost him and Hawk their lives but also eliminate the Overwatch support that was keeping the other SEALs alive. Through his scope, Rodriguez could see the SEAL team moving through the village streets under heavy fire, still several hundred meters from their extraction point.
Taliban fighters were pursuing them and attempting to cut off their escape routes. Without continued sniper support, the team's chances of reaching safety were minimal.
But the Taliban fighters climbing the mountain were now so close that Rodriguez could hear their voices as they coordinated their final assault on the sniper position. In less than 2 minutes, they would reach the summit and engage Rodriguez and Hawk at close range where the sniper rifle's advantages would be negated. Rodriguez made his decision. Instead of abandoning his position to save himself, he turned his rifle toward the Taliban fighters pursuing the escaping SEAL team and began engaging them systematically. If this was going to be his last few minutes alive, he was going to ensure that his teammates had the best possible chance of survival. Rodriguez's rifle cracked again as he eliminated another Taliban fighter who had been moving to intercept the escaping SEAL team. Through his scope, he could see Bull and his men making steady progress toward their extraction point, but they were still taking heavy fire from multiple directions. The village had become a maze of hostile fighters, all determined to prevent the Americans from escaping. Behind him, Hawk's M4 carbine rattled in controlled bursts as he engaged the Taliban fighters who had almost reached their mountain position. The sound of incoming AK-47 rounds striking the rocks around them was constant now, creating a deadly symphony of ricochets and stone fragments. Rodriguez knew they had perhaps 60 seconds before their position would be completely compromised. "Contact front!" Hawk shouted as 3 Taliban fighters appeared less than 50 meters away, scrambling up the rocky slope with their weapons ready. Hawk's return fire was immediate and accurate, dropping 2 of the attackers before they could find adequate cover. The third fighter dove behind a boulder and began firing rapidly in their direction. Rodriguez maintained his focus on the village below, knowing that every second of sniper support he could provide increased his teammates' chances of survival. Through his scope, he watched Alpha 2, the wounded Petty Officer Martinez, stumbling but still moving with the assistance of another SEAL. The team's refusal to leave anyone behind was inspiring, but it was also slowing their movement through the dangerous village streets. A Taliban fighter with an RPG appeared in a doorway ahead of the SEAL team's path, raising his weapon to fire at the advancing Americans. Rodriguez shifted his aim quickly, calculating the range at 2,800 meters with a moderate crosswind. He fired just as the enemy fighter was about to pull the trigger on his rocket-propelled grenade. The .50 caliber round struck the RPG gunner in the chest, killing him instantly and causing the unfired rocket to fall harmlessly to the ground. Rodriguez immediately worked the bolt action to chamber another round while scanning for additional threats to his teammates below. "Good shot," Bull's voice crackled over the radio, slightly distorted by static and the sounds of combat. "That RPG would have wiped out half the team."
"We're 200 meters from extraction point Alpha."
Rodriguez felt a moment of relief knowing that his teammates were getting closer to safety, but that feeling was immediately replaced by concern as he saw more Taliban fighters emerging from buildings throughout the village. The enemy seemed to have an unlimited supply of fighters, and they were all converging on the area where the SEAL team was attempting to extract.
"Hawk, how much longer can you hold them?"
Rodriguez called to his spotter while continuing to engage targets in the village below. Hawk fired another burst at the approaching Taliban fighters before responding, "Maybe 30 seconds before they reach us." "Rodriguez, we need to move now or we're both dead." Through his scope, Rodriguez could see that the SEAL team had reached an intersection where 3 village streets came together.
Taliban fighters were positioned at the far end of each street, creating a deadly crossfire that would be impossible to survive.
The team had taken cover behind a low stone wall, but it provided minimal protection against the volume of fire being directed at them.
Rodriguez realized that conventional sniper tactics would not be sufficient to clear all 3 streets simultaneously.
The Taliban fighters were too numerous and too well positioned. But he also remembered another unconventional technique that might provide the solution his teammates needed. Looking through his scope, Rodriguez could see that one of the buildings overlooking the intersection had a water tank on its roof, a common feature in Afghan villages. The tank appeared to be made of metal and was positioned directly above where several Taliban fighters had taken cover.
If Rodriguez could rupture the tank with a precisely placed shot, the resulting flood might create enough chaos to disrupt the enemy's coordinated fire.
Rodriguez adjusted his aim point to target the base of the water tank where it connected to the building's roof. The range was approximately 3,100 meters, and he would need to compensate for the elevation difference and wind conditions. But, if successful, the collapsing water tank would not only flood the area below but also potentially crush or disable several enemy fighters. "This is either going to be brilliant or completely insane," Rodriguez muttered to himself while settling his crosshairs on the tank's support structure. Rodriguez fired, and the .50 caliber round struck the water tank's mounting bracket with devastating effect. The tank immediately began tilting as its support structure failed, and thousands of gallons of water began pouring out through the breach.
Within seconds, the entire area below was flooded as the tank collapsed completely, crushing at least 2 Taliban fighters and sending the others scrambling for higher ground.
The chaos created by the collapsing water tank provided exactly the distraction the SEAL team needed. Bull immediately ordered his men to move, and Rodriguez watched through his scope as the 6 SEALs bounded across the intersection while the Taliban fighters were still dealing with the unexpected flood. "Outstanding improvisation, Overwatch," Bull's voice came through the radio with obvious admiration.
"That water tank trick bought us the opening we needed. We're almost to extraction point Alpha."
But Rodriguez's moment of satisfaction was interrupted by the sound of AK-47 fire striking the rocks just inches from his head. The Taliban fighters pursuing them up the mountain had finally reached their position and were now engaging at close range. Rodriguez rolled behind a large boulder for cover while Hawk continued returning fire from a different position.
"Rodriguez, we're out of time," Hawk shouted while changing magazines. "They're on top of us."
Through the gap between 2 rocks, Rodriguez could see at least 5 Taliban fighters spreading out across the mountain summit, using the rocky terrain for cover as they advanced toward the sniper position. Their movements were coordinated and professional, indicating that these were experienced fighters rather than hastily recruited militia. Rodriguez slung his sniper rifle across his back and pulled out his sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226 pistol that would be much more effective in the close-quarters combat that was about to ensue. But he also knew that pistols against assault rifles was not a favorable matchup, especially when outnumbered more than 2 to 1. "Hawk, we need to move to secondary position," Rodriguez called out while planning their withdrawal route across the rocky summit.
"Can you provide covering fire for 10 seconds?
Hawk immediately opened fire with his M4 carbine, forcing the approaching Taliban fighters to take cover while Rodriguez moved to a new position among the rocks. The mountain's summit provided numerous hiding places, but it also meant that the enemy could approach from multiple directions simultaneously. As Rodriguez moved to his new position, he caught a glimpse of the village below through his peripheral vision. The SEAL team was still moving toward their extraction point, but they were taking fire from Taliban fighters who had repositioned after the water tank incident. Rodriguez realized that even though his own situation was becoming desperate, his teammates below still needed sniper support to complete their escape. Rodriguez found a stable firing position behind a cluster of large rocks and immediately set up his sniper rifle again. Despite the Taliban fighters closing in on his position, he knew that abandoning his Overwatch mission would likely doom his teammates below. He would continue providing sniper support for as long as possible, even if it meant sacrificing his own chance of survival. Through his scope, Rodriguez could see that the SEAL team had encountered another group of Taliban fighters blocking their path to the extraction point. The enemy had positioned themselves in a building that overlooked the only route the Americans could take to reach safety. Without eliminating this threat, the team would be pinned down indefinitely. Rodriguez acquired the target building through his scope and could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different windows. The range was approximately 2,700 meters, and the Taliban fighters were well concealed behind the building's thick walls. But Rodriguez noticed that the building had a traditional flat roof with a low parapet wall that might be vulnerable to his heavy rifle. Instead of attempting to engage the individual fighters through the windows, Rodriguez aimed at the corner of the building where the parapet wall met the main structure. His plan was to use the massive kinetic energy of the .50 caliber round to cause structural damage that would force the Taliban fighters to abandon their positions. Rodriguez fired at the building's corner, and the impact was immediately visible as chunks of masonry and debris flew in all directions. He quickly chambered another round and fired at the same location, causing additional structural damage. The third shot struck exactly where the previous rounds had hit, and Rodriguez could see that a significant section of the parapet wall had collapsed. The Taliban fighters in the building were clearly shaken by the precision bombardment of their position. Rodriguez could see them moving away from the windows facing his direction, apparently unwilling to remain in a structure that was being systematically destroyed by accurate sniper fire. The threat to the SEAL team's escape route had been neutralized. Target building neutralized, Rodriguez reported while scanning for additional threats. Alpha team, your route to extraction should be clear. Bull's response was immediate, copy, Overwatch. We can see the extraction point. 2 minutes to pick up. But Rodriguez's relief was short-lived as the sound of automatic weapons fire erupted just behind his position. Hawk was engaged in a fierce firefight with Taliban fighters who had managed to work their way around the rocky summit to attack from an unexpected direction. The enemy was now on 3 sides of their position and closing fast. Rodriguez turned his sniper rifle toward the Taliban fighters engaging Hawk, but the range was too close for effective use of the high-powered scope. He switched back to his pistol and began engaging targets at ranges of less than 50 meters. The rocky terrain provided both cover and concealment, turning the mountain summit into a deadly game of cat and mouse. A Taliban fighter appeared briefly between 2 boulders, and Rodriguez immediately engaged him with his pistol. The range was approximately 30 meters, and Rodriguez's shot struck the enemy fighter center mass, dropping him immediately. But Rodriguez knew that for every enemy fighter he could see, there were likely others moving into position under cover. Hawk, where are you? Rodriguez called out while moving to a new position to avoid being flanked by the approaching Taliban fighters. Hawk's voice came back immediately, though slightly breathless from exertion, 20 meters to your north, behind the large boulder with the crack down the middle. I count at least 6 tangos moving toward us from multiple directions. Rodriguez could hear the distinctive sound of AK-47 fire echoing off the rocky mountain walls as the Taliban fighters continued their advance. The enemy was clearly determined to eliminate the sniper position that had caused so much damage to their carefully planned ambush. They were willing to accept significant casualties to ensure that Rodriguez and Hawk did not escape. Through a gap in the rocks, Rodriguez caught sight of movement in the village below. The SEAL extraction helicopter was approaching the designated pickup point, a small clearing on the outskirts of the village. Rodriguez felt a surge of relief knowing that his teammates were about to reach safety, but he also knew that the helicopter would be vulnerable to enemy fire during the extraction process. Rodriguez quickly set up his sniper rifle again and scanned the area around the extraction point through his scope. He could see Taliban fighters moving toward the clearing where the helicopter would land, apparently planning to attack the aircraft during the vulnerable pickup phase.
Rodriguez realized that he needed to eliminate these threats to ensure his teammates' safe extraction.
The helicopter was still several minutes away, but Rodriguez could see at least 4 Taliban fighters positioning themselves with RPGs around the extraction point. If any of them managed to get a clear shot at the helicopter during landing or takeoff, the results would be catastrophic. Rodriguez had to eliminate these threats despite the enemy fighters who were simultaneously closing in on his mountain position. Rodriguez acquired the first RPG gunner through his scope, a Taliban fighter who had positioned himself behind a low wall approximately 2,500 meters from the extraction point. The range to Rodriguez's position was nearly 3,200 meters, requiring careful calculation of bullet drop and wind drift. But this shot was critical to his teammates' survival. Rodriguez fired, and the .50 caliber round struck the RPG gunner with devastating effect, eliminating the threat immediately. He quickly worked the bolt action to chamber another round while scanning for the second RPG position. But, as he was adjusting his aim, the sound of close-range automatic weapons fire erupted from his left flank. Hawk was engaged in a desperate close-quarters battle with Taliban fighters who had managed to approach within 20 meters of their position. Rodriguez could hear the distinctive sound of Hawk's M4 carbine answering the enemy's AK-47 fire, but the volume of incoming fire was overwhelming. Rodriguez realized that his spotter and close friend was fighting for his life just a few meters away. Rodriguez faced an impossible choice: continue providing overwatch support for the helicopter extraction or abandon his sniper position to help Hawk fight off the approaching Taliban fighters. Either decision could result in the death of his teammates, but failing to act immediately would certainly result in Hawk's death. Rodriguez made his decision in an instant. He grabbed his rifle and moved toward Hawk's position, knowing that loyalty to his immediate partner had to take precedence over the distant helicopter extraction. As he moved through the rocky terrain, he could hear the intensity of the firefight increasing, with bursts of automatic weapons fire echoing off the mountain walls. Rodriguez reached a position where he could see Hawk's location and immediately understood the severity of the situation. His spotter was pinned down behind a boulder by at least 3 Taliban fighters who were advancing under covering fire from their companions. Hawk's position was about to be overrun, and he was running dangerously low on ammunition. Rodriguez immediately engaged the nearest Taliban fighter with his sniper rifle, despite the close range making the high-powered scope difficult to use effectively. The massive .50 caliber round struck the enemy fighter with such force that it eliminated him instantly and caused his companions to immediately seek better cover. But Rodriguez's position was now exposed, and return fire from the Taliban fighters was immediate and accurate. AK-47 rounds struck the rocks around him, sending fragments of stone flying and forcing him to take cover. Rodriguez realized that he had bought Hawk a few seconds of relief, but their overall situation was still desperate. "Hawk, can you move?" Rodriguez called out while reloading his rifle with one of his last remaining .50 caliber rounds. Hawk's response was immediate, negative. "They've got me pinned from 2 directions. You need to get out of here while you still can." Rodriguez could hear the sound of the extraction helicopter approaching the village below, its rotors creating a distinctive wop-wop-wop sound that echoed off the mountain walls. His teammates were about to reach safety, but only if the remaining RPG gunners around the extraction point could be eliminated. Rodriguez still had a mission to complete, even as his own situation became increasingly hopeless. Rodriguez made another impossible decision. Instead of focusing on his immediate survival, he turned his rifle back toward the village and began scanning for the remaining RPG threats to the helicopter. Through his scope, he could see the aircraft approaching the extraction point where Bull's team was waiting. Rodriguez also could see Taliban fighters moving into position to attack the vulnerable helicopter. Rodriguez acquired one of the remaining RPG gunners through his scope and fired what he knew might be his last shot. The round struck the enemy fighter just as he was raising his weapon to engage the helicopter,
eliminating the threat and ensuring the aircraft's safety during the critical landing phase. As Rodriguez worked the bolt action to chamber his final round, he could hear the Taliban fighters on the mountain summit closing in on both his position and Hawk's location. The enemy was now less than 30 meters away and advancing steadily despite the casualties they had taken. Rodriguez knew that within the next 60 seconds, their mountain position would be completely overrun. But, through his rifle scope, Rodriguez could see his SEAL teammates boarding the extraction helicopter below. Bull's team had successfully reached safety, and the aircraft was preparing for immediate departure. The mission to capture the engineer had been a failure, but all 8 SEALs were alive and about to escape the Taliban ambush that had been designed to kill them all. Rodriguez felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that his sniper support had been instrumental in saving his teammates' lives. Even if he and Hawk didn't survive the next few minutes, their sacrifice would not have been in vain. The brotherhood of the Navy SEALs meant that no one was left behind, and today that promise had been kept. As the extraction helicopter lifted off from the village below, Rodriguez turned his attention back to the immediate threat on the mountain summit. He had 1 round left in his rifle and limited ammunition for his pistol. Hawk was still pinned down and running out of options. The Taliban fighters were closing in from multiple directions, and escape seemed impossible. But Rodriguez was a Navy SEAL, trained to fight against overwhelming odds and never surrender. If this was going to be his last battle, he would make it one that the enemy would never forget. Rodriguez chambered his final .50 caliber round and prepared to make his last stand on the mountain peak where he had spent the morning protecting his teammates. Rodriguez crouched behind the rocky outcropping with his final .50 caliber round chambered, watching through his scope as the extraction helicopter carrying his teammates disappeared over the distant mountain ridge. The sound of the rotors faded gradually, replaced by the harsh breathing and footsteps of Taliban fighters closing in on his position from 3 directions. Hawk was still pinned down 20 meters away, his M4 carbine silent now as he conserved his remaining ammunition for the final assault that both SEALs knew was coming. The Taliban fighters had been patient and methodical in their approach, learning to respect the deadly accuracy of the American snipers who had decimated their carefully planned ambush. Rodriguez counted at least 8 enemy fighters moving through the rocky terrain around their position, their AK-47 rifles ready and their movements coordinated like a pack of wolves closing in for the kill. These were not the hastily trained militia members that coalition forces often encountered, but experienced fighters who understood mountain warfare and small unit tactics. Through his scope, Rodriguez could still see smoke rising from the village below where the failed ambush had taken place. The Taliban had paid a heavy price for their attempt to trap the SEAL team, with at least 15 fighters eliminated by Rodriguez's precision fire and several more wounded or displaced by his unconventional tactics. But the enemy still had sufficient numbers to overrun the isolated sniper position. A Taliban fighter appeared briefly between 2 boulders, approximately 40 meters from Rodriguez's position. The range was too close for effective use of the high-powered scope, but Rodriguez had trained extensively in close-quarters combat with the massive Barrett rifle. He quickly acquired the target and fired his final .50 caliber round. The impact was devastating at such close range, immediately eliminating the threat and causing the other Taliban fighters to dive for cover behind the rocky terrain. But Rodriguez knew that he had just revealed his exact position with the muzzle flash and sound of his rifle. The enemy would now focus their assault on his specific location. Rodriguez immediately transitioned to his Sig Sauer pistol, knowing that the next phase of the battle would be fought at ranges where the sniper rifle would be more hindrance than help. He had 4 magazines of 9mm ammunition remaining, enough for perhaps 2 minutes of sustained combat if he was disciplined about target selection and ammunition conservation. "Hawk, how many rounds do you have left?" Rodriguez called out while scanning the rocky terrain for approaching threats. Hawk's response was immediate but grim: 2 magazines for the M4 and 3 for my pistol. "Maybe 5 minutes if we're lucky and they're stupid." Rodriguez could hear the Taliban fighters communicating with each other in Pashto, their voices echoing off the mountain walls as they coordinated their final assault. The enemy was clearly discussing tactics and positioning, taking time to plan their approach rather than rushing blindly into the accurate fire of the 2 remaining Americans. A burst of AK-47 fire erupted from Rodriguez's left flank,
with bullets striking the rocks around his position and sending stone fragments flying in all directions.
The Taliban fighters were probing his defenses, testing his response time and trying to determine his exact position among the boulders.
Rodriguez immediately returned fire with his pistol, sending 3 precise shots toward the muzzle flash of the enemy weapon. The range was approximately 35 meters, at the edge of effective pistol range, but Rodriguez had trained extensively in marksmanship and was confident in his abilities. His shots forced the Taliban fighter to seek better cover, buying precious seconds of time. From his right flank, Rodriguez could hear the sound of Hawk's M4 carbine engaging targets in controlled bursts. His spotter was clearly dealing with his own group of approaching fighters, and the volume of return fire suggested that at least 3 Taliban fighters were converging on Hawk's position simultaneously. Rodriguez realized that the enemy's strategy was to split their forces and attack both American positions simultaneously, preventing either SEAL from providing supporting fire for the other. It was a sound tactical approach that would maximize the Taliban's numerical advantage while minimizing their exposure to the American superior marksmanship. A Taliban fighter armed with an RPG appeared on a rocky ledge approximately 50 meters above Rodriguez's position, raising his weapon to fire down into the sniper's concealed location. Rodriguez immediately recognized the threat and knew that the rocket-propelled grenade would be devastating in the confined space among the boulders. Rodriguez aimed his pistol upward at the extreme edge of its effective range and fired rapidly, sending 4 shots toward the RPG gunner's position. The angle was difficult and the range was challenging for a handgun, but one of Rodriguez's bullets struck the Taliban fighter in the shoulder, causing him to stumble and lose control of his weapon. The RPG fired wildly as the wounded fighter fell, with the rockets sailing harmlessly over Rodriguez's position and exploding against the mountain face 50 meters away. The blast created a shower of rock debris and a cloud of dust, but caused no immediate damage to either American position. Rodriguez had successfully neutralized what could have been a mission-ending threat. But Rodriguez's accurate pistol fire had also revealed his position to the other Taliban fighters, who immediately began concentrating their fire on his rocky shelter. AK-47 rounds struck the boulders around him in a steady stream, creating a deafening noise and forcing him to remain in cover where his ability to return fire was severely limited. Through the chaos of incoming fire, Rodriguez could hear Hawk's M4 carbine still engaging targets with disciplined precision. His spotter was clearly holding his own against multiple attackers, but Rodriguez knew that their ammunition situation was becoming critical. In close quarters combat against multiple opponents, even the most skilled marksman would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer volume of fire. Rodriguez counted the seconds between enemy bursts of fire, looking for patterns that might indicate when individual fighters were reloading their weapons. Afghan fighters often carried only a limited amount of ammunition, and their Soviet-era weapons required frequent magazine changes during sustained fire. If Rodriguez could time his movements to coincide with enemy reload cycles, he might be able to change positions or gain tactical advantage. After a particularly long burst of AK-47 fire from his left flank, Rodriguez heard the distinctive sound of an empty magazine being ejected and a fresh one being inserted. He immediately rolled out of cover and moved rapidly to a new position among the rocks, covering the 15-meter distance in less than 5 seconds before the Taliban fighter could resume firing. From his new position, Rodriguez had a clear field of fire toward the location where the enemy fighter was reloading. When the Taliban fighter resumed his firing position, Rodriguez was ready with carefully aimed pistol shots that forced the enemy to seek different cover. The tactical movement had improved Rodriguez's situation temporarily, but he knew that such maneuvers became increasingly dangerous as his available cover options decreased. The sound of Hawk's M4 carbine suddenly stopped, replaced by the sharper crack of his Sig Sauer pistol. Rodriguez realized that his spotter had exhausted his rifle ammunition and was now engaged in pistol versus rifle combat at close range. The tactical situation had shifted decisively in favor of the Taliban fighters, who still possessed overwhelming firepower advantage. "Hawk, what's your status?" Rodriguez called out during a brief lull in the enemy fire. Hawk's response was strained but determined, "Rifles dry. 3 tangos moving on my position from the northeast. I can hold them for maybe 2 more minutes." Rodriguez looked around his rocky shelter and realized that he was running out of both ammunition and maneuvering space. The mountain summit that had provided such an excellent overwatch position was now becoming a trap as the Taliban fighters closed in from all directions. But Rodriguez also noticed something that might provide a final tactical option. Approximately 10 meters from his current position, a narrow cleft in the rocky mountain face led to what appeared to be a small cave or overhang. The opening was barely visible from his current angle, but it might provide concealment and defensive advantage if he could reach it without being shot by the approaching Taliban fighters. Rodriguez counted his remaining pistol ammunition, 18 rounds across 2 magazines, plus 6 rounds in his current magazine. 24 bullets to hold off at least 6 Taliban fighters who were armed with automatic weapons and had positional advantage. The mathematics of the tactical situation were not encouraging, but Rodriguez had been trained never to surrender regardless of the odds. A Taliban fighter appeared suddenly, from behind a boulder less than 20 meters away, his AK-47 rifle raised and ready to fire. Rodriguez's response was instinctive and immediate, putting 3 precise pistol shots center mass before the enemy could pull his trigger. The Taliban fighter dropped immediately, but his rifle clattered among the rocks where other fighters could potentially retrieve it. Rodriguez's accurate shooting had eliminated another threat, but it had also revealed his position once again and expended precious ammunition. He could hear other Taliban fighters moving to flank his position while he was focused on the immediate threat to his front. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly despite his successful engagement. The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from Hawk's position, indicating that his spotter was now engaged in desperate close-quarters combat. Rodriguez could hear the distinctive sound of AK-47 rounds striking rock mixed with the sharper reports of Hawk's pistol returning fire. The volume of enemy fire suggested that Hawk was significantly outnumbered. Rodriguez made a tactical decision that violated every principle of individual survival but honored the deeper principles of brotherhood that defined the Navy SEALs. Instead of moving toward the defensive cave position that might improve his own chances of survival, he began moving toward Hawk's location to provide supporting fire for his embattled teammate. Rodriguez moved rapidly through the rocky terrain, using every available piece of cover to mask his approach toward Hawk's position. Taliban fighters were so focused on their assault against the pin-down spotter that they failed to notice Rodriguez's flanking movement until he was in position to engage them from their blind side. From his new position, Rodriguez could see 3 Taliban fighters advancing on Hawk's location with their AK-47 rifles firing continuously. Hawk was pinned behind a large boulder with limited ability to return fire, and the enemy fighters were closing in for the final assault. Rodriguez immediately engaged the nearest Taliban fighter with precise pistol shots, dropping him before the other enemies realized they were being attacked from a new direction. The remaining 2 Taliban fighters immediately turned their weapons toward Rodriguez's position, but their movement gave Hawk the opening he needed to emerge from cover and engage them with his own pistol. The 2 SEALs caught the enemy fighters in a deadly crossfire that eliminated both threats within seconds. "Thanks for the assist," Hawk called out while moving to Rodriguez's position. "I was about 10 seconds away from being completely overrun." Rodriguez was about to respond when the sound of additional AK-47 fire erupted from multiple positions around the summit. The elimination of 3 Taliban fighters had not ended the battle, but had only provided temporary relief. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different locations, indicating that more enemy fighters were still converging on their position. "We need to consolidate our position," Rodriguez told Hawk while scanning the rocky terrain for the next wave of attackers. "There's a cave opening 10 meters to the south that might provide better defensive terrain." Both SEALs began moving toward the cave opening that Rodriguez had identified earlier, but their movement immediately drew intense fire from the surrounding Taliban positions. Bullets struck the rocks around them as they bounded from cover to cover, using classic military movement techniques to minimize their exposure to enemy fire. Rodriguez reached the cave opening first and immediately established a defensive firing position that covered Hawk's approach route. The cave was actually a shallow overhang in the rocky mountain face, providing overhead protection and limiting the directions from which they could be attacked. But it was also a potential trap if the Taliban fighters managed to surround their position. Hawk dove into the cave opening just as a burst of AK-47 fire struck the rocks where he had been standing. Both SEALs were now in a more defensible position, but Rodriguez could see Taliban fighters moving to surround the cave entrance. Within minutes, they would be completely trapped with no possibility of maneuver or escape.
How much ammunition do you have left?
Rodriguez asked while counting his own remaining rounds.
Hawk checked his magazines before responding. 14 rounds in the pistol, maybe 15. What about you? Rodriguez counted quickly. 18, maybe 20 if I'm lucky. Not exactly overwhelming firepower against 6 or 8 Taliban fighters.
Through the cave opening, Rodriguez could see Taliban fighters taking positions among the rocks where they would have clear fields of fire into the cave. The enemy was clearly planning a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the two Americans with superior numbers and firepower. But Rodriguez also noticed something that might provide one final tactical option. The cave opening faced west, toward the setting sun that was now low on the horizon. The afternoon light was creating long shadows among the rocky terrain, and Rodriguez realized that the Taliban fighters advancing from the east would be backlit against the bright sky. This lighting condition would make them more visible targets while making Rodriguez and Hawk more difficult to see inside the shadowed cave.
Hawk, do you see the lighting situation? Rodriguez asked while adjusting his firing position to take advantage of the tactical opportunity. Hawk immediately understood what Rodriguez was observing.
They're going to be silhouetted against the sky when they make their final approach.
We might be able to make this work if our ammunition holds out.
Rodriguez could hear the Taliban fighters coordinating their assault in Pashto, their voices echoing off the mountain walls as they prepared for what they clearly expected to be the final phase of the battle. The enemy had lost at least half their original numbers to the accurate fire of the two SEALs, but they still maintained numerical superiority and positional advantage. A Taliban fighter appeared at the edge of the rocky outcropping that overlooked the cave opening, his silhouette clearly visible against the bright western sky. Rodriguez immediately engaged him with carefully aimed pistol shots, striking the target center mass and eliminating the threat before the enemy could fire into the cave. Hawk engaged another Taliban fighter who appeared from a different angle, his shots equally accurate despite the challenging lighting conditions. The tactical advantage provided by the backlighting was proving effective, but Rodriguez knew that their ammunition situation remained critical. The Taliban assault began in earnest as multiple fighters appeared simultaneously from different positions around the cave opening. Rodriguez and Hawk engaged targets as quickly as they appeared, their years of training and combat experience evident in the precision of their fire despite the chaotic conditions. Rodriguez dropped one Taliban fighter who was attempting to approach the cave from the north side, while Hawk eliminated another who was moving in from the south. But, even as they successfully engaged individual threats, Rodriguez could see more enemy fighters moving into position for the continuing assault. A Taliban fighter armed with an AK-47 appeared directly in front of the cave opening and began firing full automatic into their position. Rodriguez immediately returned fire while Hawk engaged from a slightly different angle, both SEALs concentrating their pistol fire on the immediate threat. Their combined fire eliminated the fighter, but not before his automatic weapon had sent dozens of rounds into the cave. Rodriguez felt a sharp pain in his left shoulder as one of the AK-47 rounds found its mark, but he continued engaging targets without pause. The wound was bleeding but not immediately incapacitating, and Rodriguez knew that stopping to treat it would likely result in death for both SEALs. "I'm hit," Rodriguez reported to Hawk while maintaining his firing position.
Left shoulder, still functional. Hawk glanced quickly at Rodriguez's wound before responding. "Can you continue fighting?" Rodriguez's answer was immediate, until the last round.
The Taliban assault continued with determined intensity, but the enemy fighters were clearly taking heavy casualties from the accurate defensive fire of the two SEALs. Rodriguez could see bodies among the rocks where Taliban fighters had fallen to their precise shooting, and the volume of return fire was decreasing as the enemy's numbers were reduced.
But Rodriguez also knew that their ammunition was nearly exhausted.
He counted 8 rounds remaining in his current magazine with one spare magazine containing 15 additional rounds.
Hawk was in similar condition with minimal ammunition remaining.
They had perhaps 2 more minutes of combat capability before being forced to engage in hand-to-hand combat against automatic weapons. Rodriguez was preparing to engage another approaching Taliban fighter when the sound of helicopter rotors suddenly echoed off the mountain walls. Both SEALs looked up to see an Apache attack helicopter emerging from the valley below, its 30mm chain gun already oriented toward the Taliban positions on the mountain summit. "This is Chaos 6-1, came a calm voice over the radio frequency that both SEALs monitored.
"We have visual on friendly positions and multiple hostile contacts. Preparing to engage."
Rodriguez had never been so happy to hear the distinctive sound of an Apache helicopter's chain gun as it began systematically eliminating the Taliban positions around their cave. The 30mm rounds tore through the rocky terrain with devastating effect, neutralizing the remaining enemy fighters within seconds. As the gunfire faded and the immediate threat was eliminated, Rodriguez allowed himself to slump against the rocky wall of the cave while Hawk applied field dressings to his shoulder wound. Both SEALs were exhausted, wounded, and nearly out of ammunition, but they had survived against overwhelming odds through skill, determination, and brotherhood. The Apache helicopters circled the mountain summit one more time to ensure that all threats had been eliminated before transmitting Chaos 6-1 to ground units.
Area is secure. Medical evacuation is en route to your position.
Rodriguez looked out over the valley where the failed Taliban ambush had taken place and reflected on the day's events. The mission to capture the engineer had been a complete failure, as the target had never been in the village at all. But 8 Navy SEALs were alive who might otherwise have been killed or captured in a carefully planned trap. The price had been heavy, with both Rodriguez and Hawk wounded and their equipment largely expended. But the brotherhood of the Navy SEALs had been honored, and no one had been left behind. As Rodriguez waited for the medical evacuation helicopter, he knew that the bonds forged in combat were stronger than steel and would last a lifetime. The sun was setting over the Afghan mountains as the rescue helicopter approached the rocky summit. Rodriguez and Hawk had held their position against impossible odds and lived to fight another day. The Taliban ambush that had been designed to eliminate an entire SEAL team had instead been turned into a devastating defeat for the enemy. As the medical team began treating his shoulder wound, Rodriguez looked one last time through his sniper scope at the village below. Smoke was still rising from several buildings, and the streets were littered with the debris of battle.
The Taliban had learned that ambushing Navy SEALs was a dangerous proposition that carried a heavy price.
Rodriguez smiled grimly as he was loaded onto the evacuation helicopter alongside Hawk. They had both survived the day, and their teammates were safe. In the brotherhood of the Navy SEALs, that was all that mattered. The mission would be analyzed and lessons learned, but the most important objective had been achieved: everyone was going home. The helicopter lifted off from the mountain's summit as darkness fell over the Afghan landscape. Rodriguez closed his eyes and allowed himself to finally relax, knowing that the day's battle was over and he had honored the traditions of the Navy SEALs. The enemy's shout of "we're surrounded" had been answered by a single sniper's rifle, and the mountain had echoed with the sound of American defiance.